So my data came from the AdHealth dataset, and in the beginning I was mainly concerned with how the age of a person's first sexual encounter would later impact how many partners that person had as an adult. As I did further research, I began to become interested in other variables and how they would also contribute to this. The variables that I ended up examining, which are also in the codebook, include what sexuality a person identifies as, the age of their first experience with vaginal intercourse and oral, whether they have engaged in the act of paying for sex or being paid for sex within the past 12 months, whether they have been physically or non-physically forced into performing sexual acts, and when the two may have occurred, and lastly, the presence of any STDs. So before I began my study, I reviewed several related ones. The first is called Sexual Abuse History and the Number of Sex Partners Among Female Adolescents. But this one differs from the study I did because I didn't specify the gender, and also there's included, or in the AdHealth dataset, it specified do not include any experiences with a parent or adult caregiver with the same corresponding variables, and this differs from their research because they were specifically looking for that. They ended up finding that past and current victims of sexual abuse had more sexual partners during the past year than their peers who had not been. The next study I looked at was called Prostitution and Sex Discrepancy in Reported Numbers of Sexual Partners. The other research is called Prostitution and Sex Discrepancy in Reported Number of Sexual Partners. And there are several reasons why prostitutes are unlikely to be represented in household surveys in the US. And one is because a lot of them reside in temporary institutions or live in less typical lodging, such as motels, hotels, and rooming houses. And since these are not considered households, it places them outside of the sampling frames for such surveys. And lastly, this one was the closest one to my study, which is age of sexual initiation and number of sexual partners in the female Spanish population. And the way this one differs from the question I'm proposing is that it focuses on the Spanish female population, while mine does not specify a gender and is limited to data in the US since I'm using the AdHealth dataset. And I'm also examining other variables as well. So as far as cleaning the data went, I removed any of the special codes, and those are listed in the codebook as well, and removed missing information as well. Most of the data that I used didn't have outliers due to the categorical nature of some of the variables. As far as my method went, I split it into training and test sets. Roughly 30% was used for the test set, and the remaining 70% was used for the training set. So I tried both ways to create the model. So I used the reg subsets command and looked at the output and tried finding my model this way to find the right combination of predicted variables. And I also manually made a model with all of the variables and then ran a summary, and then I looked at the p-values and removed the highest ones until I got a model with a good r-squared and r-squared value and low p-values. So here are some of the diagnostic plots that I used to check my regression assumptions. So without any transformation, on the right, you can see that it sort of curves. So I then did a log transformation, which had the same x variables, but I then just changed the y variable, and which was the number of partners. And this made it a lot more straight, so the normality assumption was met. The independence assumption was met because the cases are not dependent on each other. Linearity was met as well and confirmed with the residual plot. And the equal variance assumption was not perfect. Without doing any assumptions, I found that the residuals didn't look that great. So I performed several different transformations, but I found that the best one was the log transformation. So I just kept that one, but it's still a little bit questionable even with the transformations. Okay, so the following is my model, and just to clarify, I rounded all of them to 3 decimal places, And then the years is the age of when a person first had vaginal intercourse, and then the occurrences is for how many occurrences that person has had either paying for sex or being paid for sex within the past 12 months. And the last years is for a person's first encounter or their age with oral sex. So after doing the transformations, the p-values were still significant, and then the r-squared improved to 0.3167, which I also rounded. So you could say that 31.67% of the variance is predicted by the model, which is still fairly low. And then the following are the confidence intervals for each variable. So for the quantitative variable of the age of their first vaginal intercourse, the mean and the median were the same, so of around 16, and there's a negative correlation, and the following is also the histogram and the scatter plot that goes along with it. And for the categorical variable of whether a person has paid for sex or been paid for sex, those are the box plots and the bar plot that goes along with it. And as you can see, for the box plots, the mean definitely differs for occurrences of paid sex. So the last variable that was used in the model was another categorical variable, which was the age of a person's first time engaging in oral sex. The mean was 16.2 years old, and the median was 17 years old, and this one also had a negative correlation. So if we were to predict the number of partners from someone who had their first sexual experience at the age of 17 and has not paid for sex, and their first oral encounter was at the age of 17, and their first oral encounter was at the age of 16, it would be approximately 2 partners. And the r-square for the training set was a little bit better than the r-squared for the test set. So coming back to the main question, what factors or variables influence how many partners a person has as an adult? Personally, I don't think it's practically significant. I think the coefficients are fairly small and barely change the outcome of how many partners a person has, and also the intercept does not make much sense in this context. So the results definitely differ from when I first initially did my project. A lot of the variables I thought were significant didn't end up actually being significant. And I think if I were to do this again, I would maybe use a different model building method, such as finding the best subset